Greetings, fellow generals. This is darkfireslide, and welcome to Steel Division, Normandy 44. What went wrong? Steel Division Normandy 44 is a game developed by Eugen Systems, the makers of the Wargame series, including Wargame European Escalation, Wargame Airland Battle, and Wargame Red Dragon. And Steel Division itself was published by Paradox Interactive, though the Wargame series was independently developed by Eugen Systems. I wouldn't consider myself a hardcore fan of the series, but I have invested a good deal of time learning its mechanics, and across the series, including Steel Division, I've spent about 400 hours playing. Steel Division isn't a sequel to Wargame, but it borrows heavily from the core concepts and mechanics of the Wargame series, meaning that it is fair to make comparisons to games of that series, especially when it comes to understanding why Steel Division is arguably, in my opinion, more flawed than its predecessors, and might help to explain why the game is currently in such perceived dire straits. To quickly explain Steel Division's mechanics, it is a realistic wargame where every unit you create typically dies very quickly. There is no base building, and units are instead called in as reinforcements from a deck you can build from a set number of cards available, typically with a theme. In the Wargame series, there were often multiple ways you could customize a deck, creating, for example, an armored, mechanized, motorized, airborne, or other deck types with unit restrictions and gameplay advantages to promote specialization and certain playstyles. In Steel Division, each deck instead follows a theme, and most of the time, the customization revolves around less around which units you pick, but instead how many units you want to be able to call in over the course of a match versus calling in fewer, more experienced units. Decks in Steel Division also have varying income, whereas in the Wargame series, income was based on how many sectors of the map you control. In Steel Division, control of the map instead contributes to a victory point counter. Control more of the map than your opponent, and you will eventually win the game. More on these mechanics later. In addition to deck building, you also have to micromanage your troops on the field of battle itself, and as you can see in this battle I recorded to show while I talk about the game, units have many aspects to manage, and you can go very in-depth with their abilities, such as telling units to hold fire with specific weapons instead of just, using all of them at the same time. This is very useful when having units invade cities, for example. In addition to this, you can also use units, smoke to conceal advances or to protect from enemy fire, as well as making sure units have enough ammunition to continue fighting. To give an idea of what I mean about the game being in dire straits, though, reports from the forums on the most popular thread at the moment, does anyone think this game is beyond saving now? People are saying that at peak hours there are at most about 150 players or so playing the game online, and over the course of 24 hours, only about 450 players playing the game. This is a pretty pitiful number of players, all things considered, given how big gaming is now, and even compared to other hardcore strategy war games, including Wargame Red Dragon itself, the last game arguably in this series, it boasts about 3 times, triple what Steel Division has, even though Wargame Red Dragon came out in 2014. So, what is wrong with Steel Division that is making the game unpopular, and what can be done to fix it? But also, what are things as bad as they really seem in the first place? Well, let's start. The majority of my time spent with Steel Division was during its open early access beta, available if you pre-ordered the game, which I did. During the beta, Steel Division could best be described as a balanced nightmare. While the game is intended to reflect historical reality, it also had to make a game that wasn't completely one-sided. It wouldn't really be fun to play if it were reflecting the historical reality of the Allies almost unanimously, excepting the Battle of the Bulge, of course. The Germans just basically being completely crushed by the Allies, in time, of course. They did put up a good resistance, and I don't mean to be dishonest about history here. However, ironically, what we saw was perhaps a too faithful representation of World War II. Typically, Allied divisions would completely crush the available Axis divisions at the time. I lost my first few matches while playing as the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, nicknamed the Anvil, whom I am currently playing right now on this map. And at first I thought maybe I was just bad, I wasn't familiar with the game and its mechanics, and that had to be what was going on. But then I gave an Allied division a go, specifically the Scots Guard, and I basically found it to be a cakewalk. It was really, really easy to play as them. And I went to the forums, as any disgruntled strategy player should, and found that many others shared my opinion. However, there was a lot of fierce opposition to buffing the Axis divisions on many grounds. Some veteran and really good players, the ones that were actually playing versus mode, insisted that everyone was just bad, basically, and or unfamiliar with the mechanics, while others cited the historical grounds that, and I actually did see this in a post, well, the Axis lost the war, so why should the game be even? Others still insisted that the disparity in teams was due to the small number of divisions currently available, and that some divisions were just well suited to defeating others. However, Eugen did take steps to try to improve the Axis, and much of the balance has revolved around trying to make the Axis teams better. And if I sound like an Axis fanboy, I apologize. My experience was, for the most part, playing this game, when I have played it, that the Axis was just kind of underpowered. And as you can see in this beginning part of the match that I'm currently playing, I just cannot seem to get a hold of the map, which means that I am going to be losing this match for the majority of it. But changes came slowly when it came to balance, especially even in the beta, when supposedly the developers are working hard to get the game in an acceptable state before the game actually releases. However, much of the effort during the beta wasn't really made towards balance. In my experience, much of it was put towards polishing the game's graphics and optimization. A lot of the people in the beta felt really disgruntled about this, as the Allies continued to just kind of trounce everyone, for the most part. And the meta at the time, and arguably still, favored decks with high early income. Steel Division runs on a phase system, where there is a Phase A, which is the first 10 minutes of the game, a Phase B, which is the 10-minute mark to the 20-minute mark, and then Phase C, which is the 30-minute mark on, basically. Or the 20-minute mark on, I should say. Every deck has a different amount of income during different phases, and this basically means that certain decks are better in the early game, and some decks are better in the late game, and some decks have good, mid game. As you might expect from teams in RTS, some decks, some teams are just better at certain phases than others. Though typically they still attempt to be balanced if they are this asymmetrical. However, the majority of the Allied decks were focused around being good in the early game, while the majority of the Axis decks at the time were focused on being, late game. They were designed to basically get hit really hard in the early game and then come back, kind of have a comeback later on. However, basically how it works is kind of what you're seeing here in this match, where the Allies just take the entire map, well, not the entire map, they take a large portion of the map, and then because they take so much ground early, because their decks are built around being so strong in the early game, they use this advantage to basically dig in and become really, really difficult to dislodge, and this makes it really, really difficult for Axis to come back, because the Allies still have a lot of tools at their disposal for digging in, and in a realistic game like this, and for a lot of other mechanical reasons, it is often very easy for a defending player and very difficult for an attacking player, just kind of in general, in my opinion. And this didn't help that, in general, even the decks that were supposed to be worse in the late game still had pretty good income, and sometimes would still make gross more income than the late game teams did. And so sometimes it even just came down to like this just flat numerical advantage. But that's just kind of the point, right? So that the meta kind of revolved around this flow of early game decks being good, late game decks not so good. So iconic decks that revolved around tank pushes and things of that nature were typically very underwhelming, and infantry-centric decks that excel in the early game typically dominated and do well. And as far as I understand, the decks that were still really good in early access in the beta are more or less still some of the best decks. The Scots, for example, are still extremely good. The Canadian AI, who I'm currently fighting right now, Also really, really powerful in the early game. As we can see here, I am reeling for the first 10 minutes of this match, and even for the next 10 minutes after this, you will see me struggle to kind of come back from this. And I don't consider myself to be like an expert at this game, but I also do have a lot of experience with this series, so it's not like I'm completely inept and don't know what I'm doing at all. It's more just a matter of how this game is designed, and we'll see as the match progresses. And I will let this match run in its entirety for you to see with your own eyes kind of what my experience is, to kind of understand more about what I'm talking about with this game and its meta. But anyway, I digress. So what would often happen is, even if the Axis did manage to come back, the default time limit on matches was 40 minutes. This was the official posted time limit for matches to get enough points, as we can see here, to actually win the game. And so oftentimes what would happen is even good Axis players would simply they didn't have enough time to, get those late game troops that are supposed to win the game for them. They just didn't have enough time to actually take the map back and win the game. So this is just another issue with that meta, and it's something that is fixed if you play with a longer time limit, or just don't play with a time limit like I'm doing in this matchup. But it just kind of also, again, points to some of the balance issues that this game has with its general core design philosophy. So, in the early access beta, suggestions in response to these issues from the community were pretty mixed, and all seem to, involve core changes to the game's design philosophy that, in my opinion, are part of why Steel Division just isn't as good as Wargame. There are many comparisons to be made, but let me start with some of the core concepts. In Wargame, the default game mode was called Destruction, and how it worked is that each player got points every time they killed an enemy unit equal to that unit's cost. This meant that it was a game of efficiency. Kill more enemy units than what you were losing, and you would eventually win the match. Point income, instead of being tied to the deck, was instead based around these capture points on the map that when you captured with, command units, like these little trucks or infantry or things of that nature, when you would capture, you would get, income, and that's how it worked. Whereas, the default mode, and hold on, let me back up a second. So, these design choices with this game mode promoted intelligent and careful gameplay, and things like ambushes, airstrikes, and so on were devastating because of how efficient they were. When you combine this with the series reconnaissance system, which you can kind of see here, units have a sight line that they can see enemy units in, and things like hedges and buildings block line of sight. And you have a very tense game where you're never really sure who's going to get hit by an airstrike next, or a missile ambush, or, what have you. Steel Division's default mode, as we're playing here, is Conquest, and it is instead a mode based around controlling the map by using command units to push front lines, much like you might see on a large map of a front, like on an actual general's map or something. However, the only intrinsic value of killing units in this mode is that if you kill enough of them, you can push the front line. Thus, the game becomes more about rushing and land grabbing at the start, especially at the start of a match, and then digging in, than it is about hunting enemy units and striving for the destruction of enemy troops in efficient fashion. It encourages passivity to the team which grabs land first, and many decks are tailored around this take and hold mentality. Without the likes of missiles and precision artillery strikes, however, dug-in units and tanks are often difficult to dislodge by comparison to the Wargame series, even when using proper tactics like flanking, using smoke to cover in advance, or using large amounts of artillery to cause the enemy to panic. The tank combat, one of the most iconic parts of World War II battles, is also in a questionable position in this game. While I understand that most World War II tanks, with the exception of M4 Shermans, did not have stabilizers for their weapons, I could be wrong on this, of course, it's important to understand how stabilizers worked in Wargame, since Steel Division shares its engine and kind of core ideas. Stabilizers allowed tanks in Wargame to take aim and fire even while on the move, typically at reduced accuracy, an advantage that high-end tanks could use a devastating effect, with tanks such as the M1A2 Abrams or Leopard 2A5 having almost as good on-the-move accuracy as they did stationary. This made it possible to execute flanking maneuvers that could break a front line, or even just destroy an enemy heavy tank to allow your lighter vehicles and infantry to move in with their firepower. In Steel Division, however, tanks do not have stabilizers. None of them do. They cannot aim while moving, which means that to engage an enemy target, they must take a moment to stop before their aiming cycle can commence. This can result in frustrating situations where a stationary yet flanked tank can simply kill its flanker, since moving targets are just as easy to hit as stationary ones, and even if the stationary tank doesn't get the first shot off, the game's brutal RNG can mean that a flanking maneuver is often as risky for the flanker as it is for the flank target, which seems backwards when it comes to actual gameplay and compared to actual World War II tactics involving tanks. Another issue with tanks compared to Wargame is that the number of available tanks for deployment in a given match are quite low due to both their high costs and low availability in the decks themselves. In Wargame, it was possible to deploy a few high-end tanks every match and still be able to cover the front line effectively, while in Steel Division, investing in a heavy tank can often mean losing an entire flank simply because there aren't any men left to cover it, and if you lose the heavy tank, God help you. Furthermore, tanks are easily double or triple the price of their Wargame counterparts, and this means that it is often prohibitively expensive to deploy, and especially lose, even basic medium tanks, or at the very least, makes them risky to use depending on the circumstances. These mechanics likely prove very frustrating for new players, especially with how the game's armor and armor penetration mechanics work. The closer you are to a target with kinetic rounds, the higher your penetration. These issues with tanks make an armored deck almost suicidal to use in a 1 versus 1 situation, or even 2 versus 2 matchup, because oftentimes you need more bodies than you need tanks, especially given how often ineffective tanks are at what you would expect their role to be based on historical evidence and based on how they work in the Wargame series. One issue that many Wargame veterans find irritating, and newcomers do as well, is the inability to replace casualties or repair vehicles. In Wargame, supply trucks were capable of fixing damaged vehicles on the spot, as well as giving reinforcements to infantry squads that had suffered casualties. This feature is strangely missing from Steel Division. While I understand that it's not hyper-realistic to fix a broken tank engine or gun in 20 seconds, or that a supply truck always has a few extra recruits on hand, mechanically this encouraged players to be careful with their and smart with their units, because damaged units could live to fight another day. While there is now a mod that allows for this mechanic to a degree, it feels like something that should have been in the game in the first place. Another large mechanical issue with the game is that the customizability is severely lacking compared to the Wargame series. Most differences between units are largely statistical, where a decision of what looks like 12 to 20 infantry units is really only varying numbers and veterancy of about 3 to 4 different types of infantry squads, although to be fair, this is no stranger to the Wargame series either, especially in the smaller nations in Wargame. The same logic often applies to tanks too. An individual deck will play largely the same regardless of what choices are made in its construction, and often each deck has objectively better choices that can be made about its construction. While the same was true in Wargame, each deck had many choices about its construction that made deck building as much fun as the actual gameplay. Most vehicles and infantry brought something different to the table, and there were plentiful choices about what kinds of transports infantry could use, as well as the missile vehicles, anti-air, and tanks that accompanied them. Customizing and optimizing a deck was a thoughtful process that catered to the hardcore audience Wargame attracted, and encouraged experimentation and unit choices. In Steel Division, there is little experimentation to be done due to the limited customization of the decks, and due to the balance issues that exist in the game. As a side note, the game also falls into the classic World War II strategy game trope of having the Allies generally have a better early game, and having the Axis generally having a better late game. Given the game's attention to detail, I thought the developers might have tried having things the other way around, since the Germans focused on aggressive first strikes for their tactical doctrine, while the Allies typically focused on mass firepower and overwhelming numbers. Even late into World War II, they still kind of had this aggressive, tactic, this battle plan. But this is something that in a strategy game typically makes more sense to have near the end of the match. This is a small gripe, but one I thought I would mention anyway. While the issues I've just mentioned are mechanical and based on actual research and experience with the game and its forum, the next part is largely speculation based on what I understand about Steel Division's community, as well as Eugen's history as a developer. Nonetheless, I have a few thoughts in addition to Steel Division's mechanics that may explain why the game's community is falling off so quickly. First, an accurate comparison about each game's numbers must be done. Wargame European Escalation, released in 2012, has the highest number of owners according to Steam Spy at over 800,000, but it has the lowest concurrent players of all the games at about 72 in like the past week. By comparison, Red Dragon, released in 2014, has 456,000 owners with 1,100 concurrent players. Steel Division was released this year and has 100,000 owners and about 450 concurrent players. Steel Division's highest concurrent user count was 635 in its lifespan, so in reality the game hasn't dropped off that much in terms of actual people, although that is about a 33% loss in concurrent players. However, compare this series to the much more popular Company of Heroes. Company of Heroes 2 has 2.2 million owners and had a peak concurrent user count of 6,095 in the same time frame when I was doing this research, and Company of Heroes 2 was released in 2013. This leads me to a few conclusions. The lower player count in Steel Division could be for a number of reasons. While the actual number is lower compared to Red Dragon, one large difference between the games is that Steel Division is the first game where Eugen attempted to include a deliberate matchmaking service to attempt to match players with other players of equal skill, as you might expect from a higher budget real-time strategy game. However, due to the low number of players already and issues with the matchmaking itself, this results in slow matchmaking, often to opponents which are largely better or largely worse than the player searching. But the number of players searching for a game on the matchmaking has doubtless hurt the number of players finding custom games and lobbies, which previously was the only way to play versus multiplayer in the past. And split between these are the sizable number of players who likely play the game for its single-player campaigns and skirmish content, myself included. These divisions in the player base mean that Eugen has functionally shot its small player base in the foot, and makes it so that the best means of playing multiplayer are to find actual friends and play with them, something which isn't really easy to do when the game has a $40 price tag to begin with. The loyal player base is also handicapped by Eugen's slow response to the imbalances in the game meta, which, as I understand, are still largely unchanged since the game's launch in May. A balance patch was released on August 9th, but this patch hasn't satisfied many hardcore members of the community looking for better and more drastic changes to the metagame, and it certainly has not appeased players looking for new content. And, in fact, some argue that the patch has done more harm than good due to certain buffs, such as a blanket buff to all anti-aircraft guns that makes certain units pretty overpowered. Yet all this discussion doesn't even begin to touch the overall issue that most real-time strategy games are, for the most part, in decline. The only RTS game that really has a majorly active player base anymore, arguably, is StarCraft 2, with a player base still in the hundreds of thousands after so many years. Its biggest competitor, Company of Heroes 2, still had about 141,000 users in the last 2 weeks. Steel Division, by comparison, has had about 21,000 users in the last 2 weeks, which isn't too bad, but it's still dwarfed by the larger giants that it's competing against. I suspect that, like many real-time strategy games, the silent majority of players only like to play against the AI, which is something I myself typically do as well. That being said, the reason for the fall of RTS as a genre on the whole basically comes down to the accessibility and player-friendly MOBA genre, on which League of Legends alone still holds the largest player base of any game on PC, or ever, so many years after its release, still having about 11 million players on the regular. And that's kind of a problem for Steel Division. As much as I hate to admit it, being a grand strategy player and an RTS veteran, I find myself struggling with Steel Division, especially in 1 versus 1 situations, and even against the AI, just because of the sheer amount of micromanagement involved. It's often very stressful, and the list of things to do in a 1-minute span is sometimes insane. Tell a unit to move to cover, fan out 5 different units across 2 fronts, make sure command units are advancing and giving veterancy bonuses, move recon units to appropriate cover, make sure artillery is in range, remember which units can use smoke, remember to use that smoke, make sure your tanks aren't being flanked, remember to reverse them if they get shot at, use artillery to smoke or bombard a position, remember to call in new units, decide which new units to call in while doing all of the above, and the list goes on. I know the game is complicated, but adding in some basic features, like a feature to cycle through idle tanks for example, or adding buttons for control groups, could go a long way to making this game easier to manage in the heat of battle. And as a final thought on this, maybe the game just needs to be slowed down a little bit, period, to give more time to think about decisions instead of everything being quite so fast and lethal as it currently is. There are many issues I probably haven't discussed involving minute unit imbalances and things like how broken the veterancy system was until a very recent patch, but I think my general points are largely accurate involving Steel Division's flaws. So what can Eugen do to make the game more popular and bring in new players, as well as retain the loyal fan base? For starters, Eugen could lower the sales price, either through a permanent price change to $30, for example, or by having the game appear in more sales, even though it's a newer title. As well, Eugen should become more transparent with its user base. People like to know what's going on behind the scenes, and if they really care about what their small community has to say, this could help speed up making the game more well-balanced. I don't believe, as many do, that the game's income inequality between decks has to mean that the game will always be imbalanced. It simply means that much more care must be taken to balance certain deck types, to make the game more enjoyable for, well, all types of decks. Furthermore, Eugen needs to work hard on creating and promoting new content, including more iconic divisions and units to entice players. The expansion of existing decks with more unit types would also go a long way in creating the feeling of customization and decisions present in the Wargame series that, in my opinion, is sorely lacking from Steel Division. Steel Division is a largely beautiful game, graphically compared to its predecessors, with mostly high-quality production values, and due to Eugen being published by Paradox, Steel Division has had the necessary marketing and budgeting through ads, and even streamers playing the game that should have brought in a larger fan base. And perhaps the game will get that fan base if more effort is done to refine the game into a better, deeper experience that longtime fans and newcomers are both looking for in the type of game that Steel Division is. But that's all for now, so thank you for watching if you've made it this far. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more strategy content in the future. And if there's anything you'd like me to cover, be sure to leave it in the comments. And of course, comment with your own thoughts on how you feel about Steel Division and the state that it's in. And let me know if this game interests you, because this game could certainly use, players. And who knows, maybe this is the hardcore World War II strategy game that you're looking for. Steel Division really isn't a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, some of the production values, voice acting, and unit models, for example, are better than Wargame, the series that preceded it. But anyway, that's going to be all for now. I'm going to let the rest of this replay play out in case you're interested in seeing how this match ends, considering it has been a pretty close fight so far. But Godspeed, you brave souls, and I'll see you on the next one.
Lanzer zur Stelle. Ah, es hat mich erwischt! Wir müssen hier raus! Alle mal zurück! Ihre Befehle. Ruhe, herhören. Feind direkt vor eigener Stellung.
Feind gesichtet. Seid auf der Hut.
Ich höre.
Feind in der Nähe. Beschützt die Artillerie.
Sie ist zerstört. Hero 2, Feind gesichtet.
Der brennt lichterloh. Don't shoot. Spähtrupp bereit. Feind gesichtet. Seid auf der Hut.
Jawohl, Herr Kommandant. Volltreffer. Sie ist zerstört. Gute Arbeit, Lichtschütze.
Feind gesichtet.
Alright, as we draw to the close of the match here, I just want to thank you again for watching, if you decided to, and hope you enjoyed the video, both either for its commentary or for the gameplay itself. I do recommend giving this game a try if you are itching for a new World War II strategy game, and until then, I'll see you on the next one. Have a good one.